Hello, everybody. We're honored to welcome Dr. Nicholas Smith, Professor Emeritus of Humanities and Philosophy at Lewis and Clark College, and a leading scholar on ancient Greek philosophy, co-author of Socrates on Trial in the award-winning Plato's Socrates. Dr. Smith has offered groundbreaking interpretations of Socrates' defense and philosophy. His work explores the relevance of Socratic principles and intellectual rigor and moral character, shaping how we understand and teach these timeless ideas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith to our discussion today.
Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. I want to spend, if you don't mind, Dr. Smith, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes talking to the families who are watching this because it's important that they know why I chose your book to incorporate into the curriculum. That way they have an idea of that. Okay, so there's a few reasons actually. Isn't just one? It teaches moral integrity. Socrates' unwavering commitment to truth and justice inspires students to hold firm to their principles even in the face of adversity. And this is in particular important to high school students because of the peer pressure. I mean, I guess all students necessarily. I don't want to just single out high school, but high school especially, because it isn't just peer pressure at their school, influencing them to do certain things that may contradict what would be beneficial to them, but also the inundation of social media. I mean, we're just inundated. This whole entire generation is just, I feel bad for them because they're just swamped with information, and all this information can influence the wrong way. So, but it teaches moral integrity of how to face that and keep true to your principles. Develops critical thinking. Examining Socrates' defense and the arguments presented, students learn how to think logically, question assumptions, and construct well-reasoned arguments. And that goes along with teaching moral integrity to a point that, like I said, how much misinformation and disinformation is going around today with social media, news. Who do we believe anymore? And it's more difficult now to try to determine these things, I believe, than it was back then. I mean, every generation has their problems with that, but I think now it's just, especially with the coming of AI, AI can do amazingly things of getting other people's voices down to down to the T, and they never said it to begin with, but they say, well, we have you on video saying this, and so it's hard. It's going to be very. You need to have critical thinkers to learn how to address that. Explores ethical decision making. The book provides a foundation for discussing ethical dilemmas, encouraging students to evaluate the consequences of their actions through Socratic principles. Again, it's important that we take responsibility, examine ourselves before we point the finger, and I think ethical decision making helps us do that. Foster intellectual rigor. Socrates' method of inquiry, as interpreted in this book, challenges students to engage deeply with complex ideas and sharpen their analytical skills. I can't put the importance on that, especially in today's world. Somehow we need to sharpen the critical thinking, not just for students, but I think everybody. It's not just a one generational thing. Connects philosophy to real life. The trial's historical and philosophical context helps students see how ancient ideas about justice, morality, and citizenship remain relevant today. And this is important. I really wanted to discuss a little bit of this because this is why in my school, students are going to be helping the community. So, for example, in our PE, where we've gotten permission from the Board of Education to use PE for the students to go out and help the elderly do chores. Right, and that's their PE credit.
Great.
And disabled, whoever it might be. And also the cooking that we have and everything, students will be going out and feeding families in need, the homeless, things like that. So schools, in particular, high schools, shouldn't be a closed system. It should be more open, where there's a dialogue between the community and the school itself. Okay. And lastly, promotes respectful dialogue. Well, we don't have a problem with that, do we? Seriously. No, everybody gets along just fine when it comes to talking about politics or anything like that, right? So, but this gives us a great way to how to address everybody's different views on things. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started.
Can I just quickly comment on that last bit?
You bet.
I mean, I think one reason that I'm glad you're doing this, right, has to do with that very last point, right?
Okay.
The trial of Socrates that I wrote about in that first book with Brickhouse, they killed him,
Yeah.
right, for engaging in really respectful dialogue.
Yeah.
And so, we think our own times are particularly toxic, and they are. But this problem goes back a long way.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And no, and that's a great point. Is it gets to the point where obviously respectful dialogue was only a priority to one person, in that whole entire thing. And unfortunately, it was that one person that got killed. Socrates. So good. Socrates on trial. What motivated you and Dr. Brickhouse to reinterpret Socrates' defense in Apology, and what misconceptions about it did you aim to challenge?
So when we started working on that book, even before it was a book, actually, when
Uh-huh.
the project began when I was actually Brickhouse. This will tell you something about him. His toilet reading was a little book on Greek economics.
Wow. Okay.
And he encountered in that book that a mina of silver, I'll explain the reference to that in a moment, that one mina of silver turned out to be enough that if you invested it in a herd of goats, for example, you could make a living based on that investment. Um,
Okay.
well, the reason that was exciting to him, next time I saw him, we were already friends. He mentioned this to me is because at the end of his trial, Socrates ends up with the help of friends offering a fine of 30 minas. So that would be 30 livelihoods in effect.
Uh-huh.
And what we had learned, what everyone knew at the time we started this project, was that Socrates, the way in which Socrates defended himself, right on through until offering this as his counterpenalty, everyone knew that Socrates was just sort of having some fun with the jury and wasn't really trying to defend himself or win the case.
Mm.
But and this fine was reported again in everything that we had ever read. The fine of 30 minas was characterized as an insult to the jury and a joke.
Mm.
But if you could buy 30 herds of goats with that money, and that was just our first touch on it. So as we started talking about that, we did a little bit more research and found out that 30 minas of silver was in fact a very sizable sum of money. And it really could not be understood as an insult to the jury. It was rather the best that he and his friends could come up with by way of a penalty that wouldn't run afoul of various other principles that he was not going to allow himself to violate. So we realized that at the very end of his trial, Socrates was actually trying to convince the jury to let him go. And that's just completely different from what we read in the literature.
Right.
And that resulted in our first paper together. But once we kind of realized that was going on with respect to his final offer at the trial of a counterpenalty, it also affected all the other episodes in the trial or during Plato's account of it, in which it just seems like Socrates is saying or doing things that scholars had thought would be very counterproductive to a proper defense. But once we saw that at the end of the trial, you couldn't interpret it that way, then we looked at these other episodes, and the next thing you knew, we really had a whole book full of arguments as to why the entire trial is an expression of Socratic philosophy. And indeed, all of the things that the scholars had regarded as Socrates being disrespectful just weren't that just wasn't correct.
Mm.
So for us, this was just very exciting to have happened upon this and then thought about what its consequences are And it really led to the entire project.
Are there other scholars who are taking your defense on that too?
Yeah, yeah. It's very funny because the standard editions of translations of Plato's Apology
Mhm.
for years and years would have a footnote, and they would explain that the fine that Socrates offers is a pittance and an insult to the jury. Well, within a few years of our presenting this work, that footnote is now changed, and no one anymore says that the amount of the fine, at any rate, is an insult to the jury. Everyone now recognizes that no, it's a sizable sum of money, and there may be other things to say about it. But on that particular point, um, I think we just won the day, and no one's getting that wrong anymore.
Good. Yes. No, that's great. Yeah,
It's
that
cool.
what's that?
It was very cool. We were very
Yeah.
excited to do this. We it took us quite a while to put the pieces together, but it was fun.
Did you have, oh, I bet. Did you have a lot of resistance from your peers?
Oh yeah, when we first published the book, some of the reviews there were positive reviews, but some of the
Right.
reviews were just really heated.
Oh,
It was
sure.
kind of surprising to see scholars getting all excited about this. But the idea is it just overturned entirely this idea of Socrates who mocks his jury and makes fun of the Athenians and thus invites his own condemnation. This was something that everybody knew, as I said. And so when a couple of scholars, I mean, we weren't famous yet at all, when a couple of, a couple of guys from the states, from the colonies,
Right.
are saying that scholars in Germany and England and the US for many years now have been getting it wrong. Yeah, some people got quite excited about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. How does, since, and that, brings us to the next question here is, how does, throughout the generations, or actually, no, I'm sorry, since your book came out and up to now, how has that influence changed the way we understand his character now and philosophy? I mean, did it flip a lot? Did it?
I think within certain scholarly communities it flipped a lot. The problem is that Plato is simply one of many sources on the historical Socrates,
Mhm.
and it's always open to people to think that other sources are giving more reliable information.
Sure.
And so I'd say the arguments now are less, I still see some arguments treating Plato's Socrates with a certain degree of skepticism about the way Socrates presents his defense and such. But I would say more of that, what it's done is call into sharper contrast what what Plato has to say about the trial and what some of our other sources have to say about Socrates of the trial.
Ah, okay. It's always fascinating to get that down because it's 2,500 years old, and we're still hammering it out. But it's still nothing. One thing always seems to remain the same is his moral principles.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
And the other thing is, I mean, it, I guess there's a certain sense that how wonderful it would be to convince the entire world of my view, and no one would disagree anymore. Actually, to be frank with you, that would have rendered my career rather short and dull. Had we gotten that sort of response. The one of the great things about Socrates is that he keeps us, those of us who want to engage with his words and his thoughts, it keeps us at work on that.
mm,
Uh, and so the disagreements I find generally are very, first of all, they're mostly amicable. They weren't always, as I said at first, but they're mostly amicable, and they really just have to do with, trying to adjudicate things for which the existing evidence is simply not conclusive. And I think
right.
that's just a great exercise of the mind, and it's also, wonderfully interesting.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that has to do a lot with, the more you're able to critically think, the more you're able to be skeptical, even if it's even of your own life.
And that's the one thing that comes through in Socrates, no matter who's talking about it, right? This was the central theme. You've got to do better than just make the assumptions that are fed to you by your culture or by your upbringing. Because as we all know, when we look at different cultures, it's very easy for us to see when we look at cultures that are not our own, things that are just sort of, well, why do they do things that way? That's so strange. It doesn't make any sense. But we don't do that with our culture.
Interesting. No, that's very true. And what how do you think Socrates' approach to his trial of defense? And you did touch on this already, but I would like to kind of more navigate it to today's world. Is how do you think Socrates' approach to his trial and defense can inspire younger learners, the high school, and to navigate ethical challenge in today's world? I mean, he had his things were very different then, but today is just amazingly swamped with.
Yeah, there's a we're certainly swamped with more sources of information of whatever quality.
Mhm.
Um, but I think the same basic disagreements about values exist now as existed then. And
Oh, it's
I
true.
guess, the thing that's important to me and the thing that I would want students to see, and I tried to get my own students to see this, the thing that's interesting to me that was always just captured me about the trial of Socrates is that it is very clear. I don't think he mocks the jury. I don't think he invites his own condemnation and all that stuff that Tom and I argued against in our book. But I do think that the clearest thing is that Socrates is not willing to do just anything
Mm,
to get off.
right.
He's not willing to do things that he thinks are sort of shameful and ruinous to his own character. And in the end, he makes it very clear he would rather get the death penalty than do things that he thinks are shameful and disgraceful. And part of the reason that he doesn't want to do things that are shameful and disgraceful is because it would make a mockery of everything he's ever lived for.
Uh,
Here's why I think that's important for all of us. And if we can get our students to see this, it's really important. Are there things worth dying for? Are there things that 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 it's not worth living any longer if you're going to end up doing those things or becoming those things, right? So I think the survival instinct is obviously very strong. People get caught up in the things that everyone is deeply concerned with: survival, making a living, all these things.
yeah.
But if it's really true that there are things that make life not worth living, right?
Mhm.
It would be good to know what they are. It would be good to know how to avoid them. And most of all, it would be good to have the character where once these things are endangered, we're willing to say at all risk, no, no. There are things that are just not worth conceding. They're not worth letting ourselves get caught up in simply to survive or simply to make more money or simply to get more fame or honor or recognition among our peers. There are things that are just not worth it.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
Socrates is really just all about that. He's very clear that there are several things that people might expect him to do now that he's on trial for his life, things that they might expect him to say, and he's not going to do and say those things because they would render his life meaningless. And if he's going to render his life meaningless, he might as well just go die.
right, right. And that brings me to this hypothetical question. I think it's a nice because I was thinking about that myself. It's like, what would happen? Well, I'll just read it here. Assume for a moment that Socrates had chosen to escape death, perhaps going into exile, which he was offered, instead of accepting his sentence. Do you think apology would have ever been written in such a case? And if so, do you think Socrates would still hold the same place in the history of philosophy, or might he have become just a footnote among ancient Greek thinkers? Because his decision to accept the death sentence really is a pivotal part of the whole apology.
Yes.
You know,
And of course the dialogue written to follow it, the Crito.
yeah,
So I think the intuition behind that question is correct. That is that there is something heroic and tragic about the character of Socrates in the Apology, and that heroism and tragedy wouldn't be apparent if we knew that at the end that after all those proud words, in the end, right, he
yeah,
illegally and secretly, cheated his way out of prison and ended up in some place that he really where he really didn't belong and where he really wasn't doing what he had dedicated his life to do.
right,
Uh, I just think that once again that if you make a stand for certain things as the most important things, and then you prove by your own actions that you're a hypocrite.
mm,
I mean, who you know, obviously hypocrisy is accepted by many people when they witness it and shrug it off. But
right,
nobody admires it for itself. Nobody admires that behavior in and of itself. Everyone thinks that hypocrisy is sort of an ugly and demeaning character trait.
right, right. And that's a good way. It reminds me of something. It's a little bit off scripture, but it does remind me. Um, it isn't just a impulse decision to say I accept my my sentence, right? I mean, I think it's something that you have to really develop in yourself. It's a character development. It's a lifelong process, and you literally become that person, and that's how. It's easy to become hypocritical if we don't do that. It's kind of like climate versus weather. Climate is fixed, weather's erratic.
Right.
Um, how do we develop a climate within ourselves that's not hypocritical, that's only there to try to benefit the good, and the decisions come natural after that. It's not even something you're trying to do. It just becomes who you are.
Yeah. That's the
And
goal, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's what I really like about well, the apology, but also your interpretation of it, is that we're really trying to develop ourselves and look like what Socrates did for his life. It wasn't just him deciding to accept his, obviously that's a big part of it, but what brought him up to that point from his life that he was so, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to say easy to accept it. I don't know how easy it was for him to accept it, but it just seemed he was more, he didn't resist it by any means either.
No, in fact, I said earlier that our sources on the historical Socrates don't all agree about
Right,
a lot of
right,
stuff. But one thing they absolutely do all agree about is that Socrates faced his ultimate execution with not just dignity and grace, but with a kind of humor.
mm,
He was urbane and uh, pleasant to be with, and engaged in very easy conversation with his associates right up to the end,
right.
and just never showed any very special angst about it. So that's something that everyone agrees on. Now the question is, how do you get there?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and I think one thing that Socrates reminds uh, us about is that we are all, in fact, sentenced to death,
mm,
right? This is not something, it's not like, oh, gee, right, if I do something kind of sneaky, I won't die. Uh, you're going to die anyway.
right.
The question is not if, but when. And so, yes, it's not something to sort of invite upon yourself on a whim, right? Especially if you think your life has meaning.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, we're all operating under a death sentence. And and so since that's not something that we're going to be able to jettison
Yeah,
from our destiny,
right.
then the question is, how do we get there in a way that's not going to just shame us and prove us unworthy of all that's been given to us and all the resources we've gobbled up along the way.
That's I never thought about that. That's an interesting point. Even though it's obvious that we all know we're going to die, but do we really? How much thought do we put into what that means? We just know
Right.
it,
Well,
but
but I,
what does it mean?
but
Yeah.
I think he has given it thought. And at a certain point, he comes to regard that his own mortality as, just something to be fully accepted, something to be acknowledged, something
Mhm.
that turns out to be um, relatively unimportant since it happens to absolutely every one of us.
Right.
Right? This isn't like some disaster that we might avoid. This is something that happens to absolutely the best and the worst of us equally.
Exactly. Exactly. And and this was just my own little observation when I was reading the apologies that hemlock is not a great way to
Oh,
to go out.
I've got some.
Yeah.
I can tell you something about that.
Sure.
And there's a wonderful bit of research. You haven't read it, I can tell, but there's a wonderful bit of research by a woman named Enid Block,
Okay.
which decisively proves, to my mind, and it just completely puts to rest the what this is another thing. What you just mentioned is another thing that we all knew until Enid did her work. Everyone knew that hemlock poisoning was a convulsive poison.
Uh-huh.
And so when you die of hemlock poisoning, you'd go into convulsions, and that's an ugly but also terribly painful way to die.
Right.
She has proven, I think, beyond any doubt that the drug hemlock. There's a bunch of different kinds of hemlocks, and there are different poison hemlocks. The one that we learned about convulsions from is the kind of hemlock that the Romans knew about. But the Greeks used a different plant,
Oh,
and the
okay.
drug in that plant is Conium maculatum. And that turns out to be um, not a convulsive, but a paralytic. So what it does is it actually paralyzes you. And it compares it to what happens in people who have Guillain-Barré syndrome. It paralyzes you. And so the way Socrates dies, she says, the way his death is depicted in the Phaedo, Plato's Phaedo,
Okay.
she says could come straight out of a toxicology textbook. That what happens is the muscles get paralyzed. And so the way Socrates ended up dying is that the muscles that allowed him to breathe stopped working. So he suffocated.
Okay.
But
So
it's
he didn't have a whole like foam coming out of his mouth and all that
all
I
that goes with aconite. That's a different poison,
right.
right? Aconite is a kind of poison that comes from a kind of hemlock, but not the kind of hemlock that the Greeks used for executions. So, and in fact, actually, all the ancient sources on death by hemlock in the Greek ancient sources are very clear that it has to do with going numb, not
Oh,
with
wow.
going into convulsions and foaming at the mouth or anything like that. So I'm glad to put that to rest and share that with. I will happily send you the citation. But it was
Please
a
do.
brilliant article by this woman who just got caught up in the question. It's a wonderful bit of research, but just the way in which she researched the question is a model of enthusiastic inquiry. It's just
Oh,
wonderful. Anyway, yeah. So one good thing we can say about the ancient Greeks is that they used a relatively humane. They may have also mixed it, by the way, with some opium.
okay.
So the form of execution was not ugly and brutal at all.
Right. That's another thing that we tend to get wrong then because I mean I always every text I read it's always been that way. It's an ugly
Yeah,
death
yeah. So that
and
so
it's
in fact, right, but
yeah.
and again, there was good ancient evidence for it, but the ancient evidence was all from the Romans who actually were working with a different plant.
Wow.
And
No,
there
that's
may,
great.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
It is cool. I mean, because these things are important. It's important
Yeah, yeah.
because it's
I've always wished one of these TV, surprises of history or something. They have these shows about things about history that are, that people have gotten wrong or whatever, exciting new discoveries. I just wish her research had been picked up for one of those. I just think it's wonderful.
well, maybe that's something you could start doing and
Uh,
get.
in my next act, I'm going to become a TV personality. I don't know about that.
Okay,
Thanks
so
for the thought, though.
yeah, you put me on there too. So let's kind of move on to the relevance of Socratic philosophy in helping young learners develop intellectual rigor and moral character. Um, Socratic philosophy places great emphasis on self-examination. How can this practice help young learners navigate the complexities of today's world, modern life, given all the temptations and how easy it is to fall into immoral principles with social media today? It's so easy. You don't even need
Sure.
peer pressure anymore.
Sure. So, the media are very different. They're much more ubiquitous, of course, but
Mhm.
social pressure is a reality of social life. And the ancient Greeks certainly had plenty of it. The other thing is they had more sort of limited interactions with other cultures and other ways of doing things, so that it was very easy from within a given culture to see that as the only possible view of reality, right?
Right.
So self-examination, I think the most important basis for it is found for in Socrates in his what very famous profession of ignorance. He always says, look, I don't know, I ask questions because I'm trying to figure these things out myself.
Uh,
Um, but you know,
I
it's
love that.
it's well, me too, right? To me,
Yeah.
it's so fundamental that in the ethical domain, it's really, really central that before we take any action, we understand what the situation is, we understand what the options are, and that we do a little bit of thinking about how whatever values seem to come into play here may link up with values elsewhere in our
Mhm.
life and activities. So if we begin rather than with the question of, oh, what would society tell me to do right now, or what would my friends think if I that instead of thinking like that, we start out with a question: what do I know that I need to know, and
Uh,
what don't I know? And I think anyone who takes that question seriously is going to discover very quickly that with respect to any look, there are easy ethical judgments. Should I blow up the world? Duh. Right. But
yeah.
there are most times when we wrestle with an ethical issue, it's because things aren't so entirely clear. It's not just obvious what the right thing is. We're aware of evidence for different ways of managing things. If we start with the question, what do I know? What can I be absolutely certain of? What can I be confident of? And what is, hearsay, speculation, just sort of peer pressure for which I have contrary evidence, and so on.
Right.
If, if you clear away the chaff that clutters the picture and just try to stick with what you know, I think the first thing we're all going to have to realize is that we ought to engage in a great deal more epistemic modesty. Epistemic modesty is the view that I'm not an expert. I don't I don't know everything I need to know to be a really good judge of this. So I need to slow down when it comes to passing judgments, when it comes to making vital decisions that will affect not just others, but my potentially my own moral health.
Right. I love that because Uh, I try to, when it comes to some things, like I used to teach math in, college and so forth, and I know certain things and I can, but that's not because I know it. It's because someone else knew it and now I do. And now, you know what I mean? It's because it's pretty definite. But when it comes to ethical principles and ethical life, all of us are in the same boat. I mean, I may be a teacher, but I'm here in life trying to figure all this out just as much as everybody else is. And so one of the things with Socratic philosophy is that you don't come across knowing, you just come across helping each other out, trying to get to what we can know. And
Right.
that's something I want to get across to families, that the teachers at the school, we're all in the same boat here. Okay, we're all just trying to figure this out just as much as everybody else is. But we do have some guidelines of how to figure that out, and we can help your child do that as well as help us. So I think it's a great point to make.
Yeah. So once, and this goes to something else that I know that you did want to talk about, but one, it's important that we recognize that all parties to a conversation recognize that,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? So if I come to a discussion with you regarding you as a fellow traveler, but you regard me as a rival or as an
Uh,
enemy,
uh,
the discussion's not going to go well.
no,
And
no,
it's not going to go well because I'm taking the wrong attitude, but it's going because you're not taking the right attitude,
right.
right? If we can just agree that we're trying to figure stuff out, this stuff matters, and it matters to both of us, and we have integrity when it comes to trying to do the business of traveling together, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So if we are able to share that attitude, then then I think there's reason to hope that, we're not going to become godlike in our wisdom,
No,
but we can do a better job than what we'll do if all we do is rely on social media or what our friends tell us.
sure, exactly. And one of the reasons, and I know this sounds counterintuitive compared to what I'm trying to get across, but I was asked how come I don't have a debate program, like a debate team where we go into competitions and things. And because it's the word competition that I don't like. I don't want, in today's debate teams and how they do things, it's all about scoring points, and you get a winner, you get a loser, and then
Right,
they walk away still not knowing what they said.
right.
And I'm trying to get away from that. I'm trying to get everyone to take different paths to try to find the same gold nugget. And maybe one path doesn't work, but let's try another path. Hey, what did you find out? What did you find out? To me, that's more a productive debate.
My son didn't do debate. My younger son, he did do mock trial, and it's a bit of the same in the sense
Mhm.
that these are good ways to learn sort of argumentation, persuasive argumentation,
Right,
but the competitive aspects make them a good deal less fruitful
right, right,
than what we can do in a spirit of fellow traveling. As I say, look, when you're traveling with somebody, you both have an interest in getting to the destination, and both have an interest, therefore, in in sort of helping the other one help you as you're both trying to get along
hmm
in this kind of partnership.
yeah, yeah, working together, even if you come from different backgrounds. Yeah,
Yes, and in fact, coming from different backgrounds can be a real bonus,
sure,
right? I'm not jarred out of some false way of thinking by someone who thinks just like I do,
right, right,
right? At the minute, as long as you're staying inside your silo, you're not going to get anywhere.
exactly. Yeah, and that's one. Well, it's kind of a little bit off topic, but it's what I wanted to say is that you got to challenge yourself. It kind of goes along with your saying. It's like with the books that I'm choosing, such as yours and a few other philosophers. Um, if the students are here, I don't want the reading level to be here. Certainly not here. I'm giving them books that are here. So you can't do
Right.
this alone. You're going to need to have help. And
Yes.
all, like
Good.
you said, fellow travelers, let's work together because it's not going to be an easy thing. Yeah, I want you guys here. Okay, grab it. Um, yeah,
I think every educator does that whenever they're doing their job well,
sure,
right?
sure.
You aim higher than where the student is, or you're not doing anything.
You're not doing it right. Yeah, yeah. You could probably drag them down actually, and I think that's a big problem in at least in Nevada, and I know our school system when I worked in Nevada, the school system here, um, the standards just are too low,
Right.
and they just are. They're just the kids are bored, and they should
It's a
be. 'Cause,
right. Yeah, no, it's a problem. And that, I mean, this is a problem for education everywhere. And when you're dealing with students who have very different levels of skill and very different levels of different kinds of backgrounds,
yeah,
it's a real challenge for an educator to find those places where everybody in the class can learn.
yeah,
That's a real challenge.
yeah. What is your view on we with families have different religious backgrounds, they have different ways of teaching the moral, ethical, and ethical principles. I don't see Socratic philosophy undermining those religions, and maybe in some parts. But do you think that there might be some clash between I don't know, let's just say the Christian religion, the Judaism, Islamic, but any of these religions, would Socratic philosophy undermine those religions in any way, do you think?
That's 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 a very complex question in a way.
Right, it is.
So let me start with with a historical point. We we have very good evidence from all the main sources, not not absolutely every one of our ancient sources, but most of the sources that seem to most scholars to be the most reliable, that Socrates was indeed a religious man.
Hmm.
His attitude towards religion, however, was uh, it was not doctrinaire.
Right,
And I think this is where we get to the other side of it. So the critical side. Yeah. So Socrates himself was religious. Obviously, whatever Socratic philosophy is, it is not by itself or in and of itself anti-religious, or
right,
that would have been a tension within him that he would have found unbearable. But he
right.
finds no such tension. Um, he says in one dialogue, there's a famous line in Plato's Phaedrus, where the character Phaedrus says to Socrates, "Oh, you don't believe all those old myths, do you?" And Socrates says, "Well, as long as I don't know myself,
Right.
I just don't really have the time or the energy to try to chase down what might be true or what might be false in what ancient Greek mythology had to say about things."
Mm,
So he basically says, I pretty much just leave that stuff alone and accept it in the, as part of my world, right? But I'm not particularly critical aiming at those things.
right.
However, one thing about Greek religion and the religion that Socrates accepted that's very different from the religions that you mentioned and the ones that are likely to be ones that our students know best, is that Greek religion really didn't have much in the way of moral messaging. There weren't commandments that you had to live by or else.
Hmm.
There weren't things that told you that if you didn't believe this, you're going to be in desperate trouble with God. Um, Greek religion really had more to do with engaging in this certain cultural practices, but very little in the way of doctrine,
Right.
and also in the way of moral doctrine. Um, and so the fact that Socrates wasn't abraded and didn't take on as a target the beliefs of his religion are partly because what he was interested in didn't conflict with it in any particular way. But the problem is if you're going to use critical reasoning in a way that's going to be have any kind of ethical traction, you have to be able to question ethical doctrines.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of these doctrines are central. I mean,
Hmm.
think of the Ten Commandments. They're absolutely crucial to the acceptance and adherence to um, these religions. I'm just using that one example, but
Right.
the same could be said of the Quran and what's in there and the New Testament and so on and so on.
Right.
So
Right.
the problem is these are doctrinal religions. And I think doctrines are just automatically suspect from the point of view of critical reasoning. They
Yeah.
may be right, but they're not going to be right because they've been commanded by religious authorities or by some other human authorities. They're going to be right for reasons that would have to do with standing back and figuring out why they're right.
Yeah. Okay. So we're producing skeptics.
Skeptics of the right
Yeah.
sort. I mean,
Yeah.
skeptics are
Yeah. Yeah.
sort of, arrogant people who run around tearing down other people's beliefs, but who really aren't worth much themselves,
Right.
right? I
Right.
don't. It's not that. Although skepticism can be benign, but it can also be a kind of smug irritant.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the kind of skepticism that simply insists on Socrates says this so well. I'll just basically report what he says. In the Crito, he tells his lifelong friend, look, I'm just the kind of guy who follows the reason that seems best to me at the time when as I deliberate.
Mm.
It just, you know, I know what I've been told uh, by my own religious authorities. I know that other religious authorities say something else.
Right.
What I want to do in order to be able to be justified in my decision making is try to figure out what do I know, what's my best evidence, and if I realize I don't have any very good evidence other than what I've been told, well, then that's the best evidence I have.
Right.
So in that sense, epistemic modesty is not completely opposed to following cultures or doctrines, but it still wants to know the reason why. Um, and it also wants to be open to the possibility that maybe these things aren't quite right.
Mm.
And in that last bit, yes, I think there is a certain risk to
Yeah.
doctrinal communities based on doctrines,
Right. Right.
from somebody who insists on following reason where it takes you.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point. There's it's important for me in the school to be very transparent to the families. They need to know what they're getting into, and it's there's a lot of deep thinking involved with this, and sometimes it's not going to be pretty. you
Yeah.
know, I know for me, I have a hard time changing views that I was impressioned upon since I was I don't know how old. And it's not easy, but
No.
got to
Well,
do it.
and Socrates knew it wasn't easy. He knew that when he questioned people about their basic beliefs, that very often, rather than opening them up to new possibilities, they just got angry with him.
Yeah. Right.
And let's
Right.
remember on the very topic we're talking about, the Socrates was put on trial and executed. The charge was impiety.
Uh,
So he went down because of being perceived as irreligious.
brainwashing the children too. I mean, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, but that's part of it. It's part of it because corrupting the youth is an example of impiety within the Greek notion of filial piety, right? You're
Right.
supposed to have a certain attitude toward your elders, in
Right.
particular your parents. And if you make children question their parents' authority, that's a violation in the ordinary Greek view of filial piety.
Yeah. Sounds foreboding in my case, like foreshadowing something what, what I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah, but it's never been easy and it's
Yeah.
never going to be easy.
Right.
But the question is it worth the risk, not just to ourselves, but to the people who we're responsible for? If
Right.
you're an educator The safe way is to tell them just what they already believe. That'll never get you in trouble.
Right. Tell them what they want to hear, and
Yeah.
yeah,
But but if you're an educator and you want to get them from where they are to step up, there's always a certain risk involved.
right.
And the risk doesn't just come, as you know, from the students, but
Yeah.
from others who have deeply invested in those students believing what they now believe.
Mm, right. Right.
In fact, educators,
Yeah.
by their very nature, get in the way of that. That's just how it works.
You mean as far as what we teach, or
Yes, look, I
oh,
mean, you taught math, but
right,
there aren't too many math nuts out there. I mean, people have nutty ideas about math.
right.
You know, you said you used to teach math. It's a relatively safe subject, but
Yeah.
you could always run into somebody who has some crazy views, and what you're teaching runs afoul of those views, and that can engender hostility. And
I see.
the closer you get to the things we really deeply value, the riskier it is. That's just the deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. I understand. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I've had that before, actually, teaching math, and um,
My brother was
it was,
a high school math teacher, so
oh, was he? Yeah.
he's told me some stories. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's just one of those things. It doesn't happen often, really, in math. What's really kind of sad was that most people just want to take the class because they had to, not really. They really had
Right,
no interest.
right,
It was
right.
just a credit for them. That's it.
That's a challenge too.
But we do the best we can to make it exciting, but sometimes it doesn't work out like that. Okay, so what I wanted to ask is, uh, so Socratic philosophy often emphasizes the pursuit of moral character over material success. How do you think young learners can benefit from this focus in a culture that often values achievement and status? And I want to just kind of tag on a little bit to that because in America, and I'm just talking about in America. I'm not really talking about other nations, but in America, we really value materialism. We value titles. In fact, I remember talking to a philosopher from Iran, and he's now over here, Professor Pejligio. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was saying it was always weird to him because that we would ask so nonchalantly what another person does when we first meet them. Say, what kind of work do you do? And they would never have even dreamed of asking something like that, and it just never crosses their mind. But that's so entrenched in us that just from the day we're born, we have to be somebody with a title, and it's just kind of I think it would be interesting to know how we can teach more moral character over material success as far as considering yourself a successful person.
Yeah. So that's a tough one in our culture for the very reasons you say. I mean,
Yeah,
it is so deeply embedded in our culture that to be anyone, to have any value at all as a human being, you have to achieve a certain kind of status, a certain kind
right,
of you have to have certain levels of achievement, and particularly levels of achievement in things that make you rich,
right,
right?
right,
Uh,
absolutely.
and I think the best way of approaching that question is to remind students of things that they do already know. We can come up with any examples you like, but I was recently I used to very much enjoy the music of Michael Jackson,
Hmm.
and I was recently thinking, and this came up in my life again, and I was thinking about his life and the end of his life, and the quality of his life from an in from what his interior experience might have been like. And you know, I don't know enough about him in terms of his biography or whatever, but it sure looks bad,
Yeah,
right? It just looks like he came to a bad end, and that he came to a bad end after a long period of sort of quiet misery, right? He was constantly medicated, um, you know, heavily, in ways that really just show a very bad quality of life.
Right.
Now, here's a person who is adored for what he has achieved, who is fabulously wealthy from what he's achieved,
Mhm.
who is, recognized as gifted and talented and all these lovely things that all of us wish we could be in extreme amounts. You could pick examples from athletes. You can pick examples
Yeah.
from, you know, the problem is we know, all of us are aware of people who are, on the one hand, fabulously successful in the way in which we are all being told we need to work hard to get successful, even a jot of that, right? Even
Right.
a tiny bit of it. We all know people who have done hugely successful in all those ways, and yet who we would regard from a certain distance as just wretched. I
Yeah.
mean, just having lived lives that must have been just miserable,
Right.
right? Um, and and pick your favorite examples. There's kind of one every week that comes up in the news of someone who, on the face of it, had it all, but who, from the most obvious and most important question any of us needs to ask ourselves is, how am I going to have a good life? And if it turns out that all that money doesn't guarantee it, doesn't
Right.
assure it, all the fame, the love, the admiration, that all of those things are completely compatible with, and in no way guarantors of compatible with just having horrible lives,
Right.
right? We need to remind ourselves of that and say, okay, well, look, what's the strategy? The strategy isn't to say, oh, money, forget money. Money's important enough, right? Because it
Yeah.
buys things that we really, really need.
Right.
Okay. So it's not about being anti-money or being recognized. That's good for you, right? We need other people to pay certain kinds of attention to us. We're social beings.
Right.
I'm not I'm not trying to denigrate any of those things, but they're not the answer,
Mhm.
right? So the question has to be, what really makes a life worth living? What will make my life, ask it completely selfishly. We all need to do this. What will make my life a good one where I can look back, at whatever age I eventually reach before I get my own death penalty. Um, and I can look back and say, I did pretty well. I did, that was good.
Right. What would be the least regrets? What path would give us the least regrets, maybe?
Yeah. And things that we can look back on with pride, right? We want to avoid regrets, but we also want to think, gee, I did that well,
Right.
and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that I had to work hard to get there, and
Right.
it was worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's but there's material wealth and then there's spiritual wealth, with our moral character. And I think you're right. There's probably far more sacrifice you're making by gathering material wealth than working on our character, our moral character.
No, I have there's a moment in Plato's Republic where something comes up, and it used to be a sort of fun thing I could do with my students, uh, where Plato has Socrates saying that he would much rather suffer injustice than do it.
Mm.
And people think, well, that's are you crazy? I mean, nobody wants to suffer injustice. But there's a wonderful moment where he talks about what justice really amounts to, and it has to do with having a certain sort of character.
Right.
And I used to ask my students, look, imagine two people walking into a bank, and it turns out there's nobody in the bank, and the vault's wide open, and the money is clearly visible, right?
Yeah.
And one of them thinks, God, I'm going to grab as much as I can and get the hell out of here.
Right.
And the other one thinks, gee, somebody needs to be called. This is not right. Right. So somebody sees it as a problem that needs to be solved and isn't tempted to steal. They're just not, they don't go there. Right. Which person would you rather be?
Mhm.
And if the answer is I'd rather be the one who sees trouble for somebody else and thinks, gosh, somebody needs to do something about that, or sees trouble for somebody else as an opportunity for self
Right.
benefit, right? Which person would you rather be?
Do
And
you
it
think?
turns out most of my students, there were always students who wanted to push back, but most of my students would say, it's really true. You don't want to be somebody who's looking for any opportunity to cheat and get away with it, for
Right.
any opportunity to do something wrong, even if you can get away with it. I wouldn't want to be that person. That's
Right.
not how I want to be inside of me.
It reminds me when you said, would you rather be the person that looks at and solves the problem? Because when you say solve a problem, the first thing that's coming to my mind is there's an intellectual curiosity there because there's a problem.
Yeah.
And so I have to ask then if having intellectual curiosity goes hand in hand with moral character, like the more intellectually you're trying to strive to find knowledge and information, then by default, does moral character develop from that as well?
To an extent. I mean, I think there are plenty of people, I think at times in my own life, I'd be guilty of this. There are plenty of people who are sort of intellectually engageable,
Right.
intellectually, alert or interested in something,
Sure.
and in a way that's sort of neutral when it comes to anything of grand ethical value. I mean, there are just some questions that just get people going.
Sure.
But I do think a certain degree of intellectual engagement, that makes it sound very grand. I think there just needs to be a certain kind of openness to what is going on
Mm.
around one, right? You're never going to be ethically successful. You're never going to be a genuinely moral person. You might do the right thing, at the right time, but it won't be for the right reasons,
Right.
right? You're never going to be a genuine ethical judge, right? Without constantly feeling the need to pull in whatever you can to figure out what the situation really is,
Mm.
and therefore what needs to be done with it. It's not just about it's sort of what we sometimes call a thinking outside the box. Well, the point is,
Sure.
uh, if what's going on outside of the box impacts what's going on inside the box, you really need to think outside the box,
It's a good point. Good
right?
point. Yeah. Um, we're pretty much running out of time, but there's one more question I want to get to before we go here. It's how might exposure to ancient Greek philosophy foster a sense of intellectual humility and curiosity in students? Now, I wanted to just tag on a little information about why I'm asking that. Is I teach math and I've always loved math and I thought I knew a lot about math until I investigated math. And the more I learn about the different fields, the different mathematical theorems, the more I realize I don't know a thing. I like, oh wow, there's just way too much out there. A lot of people will look at me that don't know. They may say I know a lot of math, but I don't think they understand that with all the math that's out there, I'm probably this much because the more you realize, the more you study, the less you know. And that's why I want to ask this: is that how can ancient Greek philosophy foster a sense of intellectual humility and just realizing that we don't know everything? And how do we get our modesty down, our ego down to what we actually know?
Well, I mean, I think you've already gestured at this at the very least, right? one thing you can get from reading about Socrates is his genuine all the way to the bone recognition of his own limitations, right?
Right.
And in that he creates a kind of role model for all of us. I think we end up kind of admiring it and realizing that the extent to which we don't live up to that standard, right? But another one, there are plenty of lines, not just in Plato or in Socrates. Aristotle begins the metaphysics, I think, with this wonderful statement that philosophy begins in wonder. Now, he doesn't mean philosophy, the academic
Right.
department. He means an interest in learning, an interest in acquiring knowledge and wisdom that we don't already have. And he says it begins in wonder. Well, what does he mean? Well, what he means is that you don't wonder about stuff that you already know.
Right.
You start out with something like, well, dang, what, I don't, what is that? Right? You start out with what you don't know. And if you're alive, right, as a mind, you start from that position and you want to go to where you're going to learn something or come to know more. So all of us at all times are in that position with respect to almost everything. Every one of us knows some stuff.
Right.
But as you said about math, think about not just math, but every subject on earth, every bit of reality. What we know would fit into an atom, right? Relative to all that's out there. Right. And so here's something that might help. Rather than regarding that as something to be ashamed of, Socrates exclaimed it proudly to everyone he could. Look at all the things I don't know. And what's to be done about it? The answer is get going.
Right. Yeah. And I think a big problem, too, at least in today, is people seem to misinterpret the word ignorance as a bad thing. Like you're just calling yourself stupid or you're calling someone else stupid by saying it. And really all that means is that you're admitting you don't know something.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's gotten a bad
It is a
rap.
state of human being.
Right.
We're all in that condition with respect to almost everything all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Even in our own subjects that we're trying to learn in our own. Yeah.
You're telling me.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Smith, I really appreciate you coming on here, and you had some great insights. It's
been a pleasure.
And I'll have the information on the website and your book and everything, and I'll get that going.
Many thanks. And I look forward to hearing the progress.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks again, Dr. Smith.
Okay, be in touch.
All right. Bye-bye.